Well, good morning. It's lovely to be here today. Let me introduce myself. As Johanna says, I'm Stuart, married to Jean. I'm one of the elders at this church, and we oversee the pastoral care here. If you're interested in joining a life group, that's a great way of getting plugged in. Do come and talk to us or one of the other life group leaders afterwards. On the welcome table, there's some cards with life groups on there. So we've been looking at the book of Nehemiah, and that's what we're going to be turning to this morning. And in particular, I'm going to just try to answer this question: how can we keep going under fire? Well, I've never been under fire from a lethal weapon myself, but I have done paintball. So hopefully there's a slide. It's not me, actually. But it hurts if you get hit, doesn't it? You can get bruises from paintball. Why do we pay money to do this? And after you've had a few bruises from paintball on your hand or the side of your neck, that's particularly painful, you get more cautious, don't you? And it can be tempting before the next game to volunteer to stay at the back and, yeah, I'll cover you while you go ahead and capture the flag. We can take a back seat, can't we, especially if we've been hurt in the past. And it can be a little bit like this in the Christian life. We've been hurt in the past. We've maybe overstretched ourselves and got a bit burnt out. We'd rather just stay at the back, let other people go forward, keep away from the front line. So how can we keep going as Christians under fire? And in our passage today, Nehemiah comes under fire. And we're going to be looking at how does he handle opposition and attacks, and what can we learn from his example. So if you've got a Bible, or put your hand up if you haven't got a Bible, and Tina, Gavin will bring you one. Hold your hand up, and if you don't have a Bible yourself, you're welcome to keep this as a gift from us. We'd love you to take a Bible home, but turn to Nehemiah chapter 4. If you don't know where it is, there should be an index at the front of the Bible, and sort of about a third or a little bit beyond of the way through. Nehemiah chapter 4. Now, a lot's already happened in the first 3 chapters we've been looking at. In chapter 1, Nehemiah considers God's call to give up his prosperous job and go serve on the front line back in Jerusalem. In chapter 2, Nehemiah takes the risk of being open with the king, his employer, who gives him the resources to go to Jerusalem, over 1,000 miles away, and start the project to rebuild these broken down walls. And last week in chapter 3, Malcolm showed us that many others, with a few exceptions, joined Nehemiah in this great work to rebuild the walls. What a great picture this is of how the church should be today, building one another up. Everyone's serving and sharing in this great work of building God's church. It's not been exactly plain sailing for Nehemiah so far, but in chapter 4, things get quite tough. Nehemiah encounters tough opposition in 4 different ways, which we'll explore this morning. So chapter 4 is really a practical account of how a godly person can overcome different types of opposition today as he or she works to build God's kingdom. So we're going to go through chapter 4, looking at how to face 4 Ds: derision, danger, discouragement, and dispersal. And I'll explain each of these in turn. So, there we are, the 4 Ds. And the first form of opposition that Nehemiah faces in chapter 4 comes in the form of words. Other leaders in the area mock this project to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And so the people of God face the first D, derision. Let's read. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, what are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" And Tobiah, the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What are they building? Even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones." So like a modern-day online troll, Sanballat channels his anger into hurtful words. He calls them feeble here in verse 2. He distorts what they're trying to do. Will they finish in a day? Can they bring these stones back to life? It seems clear from the context that he's not really trying to have a dialogue with the Jews. Rather, he's mocking from a long way off. His audience is more his associates, his own army, another leader, Tobiah the Ammonite. They feel threatened by the rebuilding project. It's always easier to sneer when you're doing it within your own echo chamber to people who share your prejudice. So how does Nehemiah respond? Does he fight back? Does he engage with these unfair accusations? Does he trade insult for insult? No, none of these things. But he is hurt by these taunts. Belittling words can be hurtful, can't they? But rather than getting dragged into a scrap with Sanballat and his like, Nehemiah has a much more constructive conversation with God. And so in verse 4, he launches straight into a prayer of desperate faith. "Hear us, O God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." So if we're insulted for being Christians, we shouldn't get drawn into retaliating with unkind words, but we are free to bring our woes to God. He hears us, and he will bring justice in due course. He hears our complaints, and he takes them seriously. It may be a long time before God calls people to account, but he has promised that there will be a day of reckoning. We can leave justice in his hands. And this relieves us of the burden and feeling of being personally slighted. It's also good to bring these matters to prayer for our own emotional and spiritual well-being. Nehemiah models this. He models asking God for retribution. But Jesus in Matthew 5 challenges us to go beyond this, to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I wonder if you've ever felt offended or slighted by other people's judgmental words about your faith in God. I've had various comments over the years from non-Christians, particularly about my work for Christian ministries in the church. People have said to me, "Stuart, that's not much of a career move." Or they've been a bit condescending and said, you just do whatever floats your boat. It's hard, isn't it, when we're trying to follow Jesus and make choices that follow him, and then we come under fire from people who don't like it for whatever reason. It might be comments about you coming to church on a Sunday, or it might not be personal attacks on you, but more broadly opinions about Christianity you hear on the TV or radio, patronizing comments about Christians, you're on the wrong side of history, or memes on social media that mock belief in God. I can't believe those Christians still believe those fairy stories. Now, these are not careful arguments, are they? But they're still wearing after a while, and they leave us feeling marginalized. So what do we do about this drip, drip, drip from the media that undermines belief in Jesus? Well, Nehemiah starts by praying to God, and he leaves the matter with him. And then instead of engaging in a tit-for-tat with his opponents, he exposes the shallowness of their taunts by just getting on with the work that God has called him to do. Verse 6, "So we rebuilt the wall till it reached half of its height, for the people worked with all their heart." So he rallies the builders. Perhaps they are heartened by this prayer, and rather than licking his wounds, Nehemiah instead gets on with the work. back in verse 2, Sanballat called the Jews feeble. But Nehemiah proves them wrong. Before they know it, half the wall is up. Tobiah scoffs and says, what are they building? Well, they're building a wall, Tobiah. And while you've been standing around criticizing them, it's already up to here. So our first challenge from the passage is facing derision. If we're derided by others, mocked for believing in God, what can we learn from this passage? Well, firstly, you don't have to pretend that it doesn't hurt. But rather than reacting directly to their criticism, let's bring our troubles to God, who cares, and leave the matter with him. I think this, perhaps for us today, is particularly what it means to turn the other cheek. There might not be many people in our society who would slap us on the face for being a Christian, but there's plenty of hurtful words being tossed around in our direction. And secondly, don't be discouraged, but let's stand firm and continue the Lord's work. Prove your critics wrong by getting on with building something that will last. If we're doing God's work, then we're contributing our efforts to something that will have eternal impact. We're playing the long game. Let's have a look at the second form of opposition that Nehemiah faced. His opponents thought that they might be able to intimidate God's people with their words. Instead, it seems to have spurred them on, doesn't it? And in the next few verses, Sanballat and Tobiah are being joined by others from the surrounding area who don't like the sound of Jerusalem being put back on the map. So verse 7, let's pick it up there. Go with the next slide. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. So the threat level was increased. The Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod have joined the opposition. The hostility is now coming from north, south, east, and west. I think I've got that right. We've heard that God's people are making headway on the repairs, and the level of emotion has ramped up from angry in verse 1 to very angry here in verse 7. They're plotting to come and fight and stir up trouble against Jerusalem. So this is going now beyond a war of words. God's people are under real physical threat to their lives. Not just derision now, but real danger. We might not identify so much with this experience, but there's many Christians around the world who certainly would. The Open Doors watch list of the countries in the world where Christians face the most persecution has many countries. I know there are people in this church who come from many of these countries. We might not personally face persecution in this country, probably goes as far as derision and marginalization we've talked about for most of us in the UK, but there's many countries full of our brothers and sisters in Christ. Is there anything we can do for them? Well, Nehemiah, as usual, sets us a good example. So in the face of dangerous threats, Nehemiah does three things, which we can see in verse 9 and beyond. Firstly, he prays to God. Secondly, he takes action. He posts a 24/7 guard. And thirdly, we see from the later verses that he's not intimidated. He doesn't stop the building work. Even though the threat level is high, Nehemiah and his builders keep on working. They just take sensible precautions. Took this screenshot from the MI5 website last week, which shows the perceived threat level to the UK of a terrorist attack. As you can see, the national threat level is currently substantial. I don't know if Nehemiah had his own secret service, but if he did, they would probably have set the threat level up to the maximum, which is critical. But anyway, they carried on doing God's work, building the wall. So we don't face physical threats and attacks in this country, but we do face real attacks from the devil. If we're making progress in God's work, we need to brace ourselves for spiritual attacks from God's enemy. which could come in the various forms we're exploring today. And although this can be hard, let's be encouraged. If the devil's attacking us, it probably means we're doing something significant in building God's kingdom here on earth. So what can Christians do facing real danger for following Jesus? Well, firstly, let's learn about the physical dangers that are facing persecuted Christians around the world. For example, our Commission family of churches has a number of churches in India. And here's a snippet from Open Doors' website about what Christians in India are facing today. It says, any Christian in India who converts from Hinduism is the most likely to come under intense pressure or even violence. They can face constant pressure to renounce their new faith, face job loss or discrimination, endure physical assaults, and even be murdered. It's serious stuff, isn't it? So let's be praying for our brothers and sisters who face real persecution overseas to keep going in their faith. If you search online for Open Doors watch list, you can see detailed information about countries to pray for. And secondly, let's be aware of the equally real spiritual attacks that we all face as Christians. For us today, fighting for God isn't about having a sword in our belts, but it's using those spiritual tools listed in Ephesians 6 to stand against the devil's schemes, knowing the truth and the gospel of salvation, growing in our faith, praying on all occasions. We were singing earlier, when I fight, I'll fight on my knees, and being alert. So we've looked at derision and danger. Let's have a look now at the third form of opposition that Nehemiah and the builders faced in verses 10 to 14. So far, the opposition has come from outside, but now the opposition becomes more subtle. God's people start to get discouraged. Let's read from verse 10. Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, the strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. Also, our enemies said, before they know it or see us, we'll be right there among them and we'll kill them and put an end to the work. Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, wherever you turn, they will attack us. So in verse 10, it's not any of their enemies talking them down. It's the people of God themselves. We're getting tired and there's so much rubble. They're talking themselves down. We know back from verse 6 that they've built half the wall, but of course this means they've still got the second half to go. And if you're building a high wall, reaching the top half is a bit trickier than the lower half. Now this reminds me of the halfway weariness that I felt when I ran the London Marathon a number of years ago. Here's part of the course map. Crossing Tower Bridge in the London Marathon is quite a milestone in this race. You've run 13 miles, you've all been sort of south of the river, and then you get to Tower Bridge, and it's packed with crowds, there's loads of encouragement, you're crossing the River Thames, you get to the embankment on the other side of the river, and you know, if you know London a bit, if you turn left here, you only have a few miles before you get to Buckingham Palace and the finish. Great, but when you come off Tower Bridge, if you're a sort of mediocre runner like me, you see some really fast runners shooting past, going left, the way you want to go, but you realize that you're going to be turning right. It's in the opposite direction from the finish line. And you've got 9 miles around Docklands to go before you even get back to this point you're at right now. It's a bit discouraging, a bit demoralizing. Yes, you passed halfway, you're over the river, but there's a whole long slog ahead of you. And I thought you might like this picture of me running in my Statue of Liberty hat. This is so that my family could see me, because the first time I did it, they couldn't see me amongst the 48,000 other runners. So had to wear a stupid hat for them to see me. Okay, you've made it halfway through my sermon now. And the question is, can you keep going? Can you keep attending right to the very end? And I wonder if there's something of that sort of halfway lull in these verses we're looking at now. The builders have passed the halfway mark with the wall. They've been working with all their heart, but they're tired. And they see the pile of rubble, and they just allow themselves to get a bit overwhelmed. We're trying to build the wall. Everyone's having a go at us. We're under threat of attack. We're worn out and fed up. Not only this, but in their despondency, they've been listening to negative voices. In verse 11, they're starting to let their opponents' taunts get under their skin. And in verse 12, they're even listening to the grumblers around them who are supposed to be on their own side. It's easy to let this stuff get us down, isn't it? In some ways, I wonder if it might have been easier for the builders to sort of stay focused when they were under the more imminent danger back in verses 7 to 9. But in these verses here, it seems like the threat of immediate attack has eased a bit, and it's sort of shifted from an all-out attack to a war of attrition. Perhaps you felt a bit like this in building Hope Church or the church that you're from. Maybe you've been on a serving team for a long time. It's hard to keep going, isn't it? Especially if you're feeling weary. Maybe there's been a bit of criticism come your way and you're feeling a bit unappreciated. Maybe you've been wounded as you've tried to serve at a church in the past and you've decided to take a step back from the front line. Yes, you still attend church, but it's hard to keep going. I think many disillusioned Christians have given up on the battle. Yes, they're still attending church, but not really building anymore. I wonder if you thought when Rahana was here holding Tina's pottery a few minutes ago, I'm glad I'm not holding that. I was certainly feeling that. But sometimes we can feel a little bit like one of those fragile pots, can't we? But that's okay. Bible tells us in 2 Corinthians that we are fragile jars of clay. That's okay. So what wisdom has Nehemiah got for us this time, if any of this resonates with us around discouragement? For derision and danger, his response was prayer and action. Let's see if it's any different this time in the face of discouragement. Verse 13, therefore, I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives, and your homes. Well, Nehemiah's approach is slightly different for discouragement, but not hugely. He starts with wise action, adjusting his defensive activity to prepare for enemy attack, and then he turns to the people and speaks to them rather than directly to God. And he reminds the people of some simple truths about God and what he can do. So what do we need to remind ourselves of if we're feeling discouraged? Firstly, that we don't need to be afraid of people. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome. Shift the focus away from your weariness. Ignore the grumblers. All those things will drag you down. We probably give too much emotional energy to our critics, don't we? Turn off the TV, turn down the social media if you need to. What's going to energize and inspire you is to bring your focus back to the Lord who is great and awesome. Don't focus on the obstacles. Focus on our great heavenly helper, our God who is great and awesome. And secondly, remember, this isn't just about you. You're fighting for your families. We're fighting a spiritual battle today to build this church. We're fighting for our brothers and sisters to persevere in their faith. We're fighting for the marriages in this church to keep going. We're fighting for the children in this church to come to know the Lord Jesus and to follow him. There's so much of value that doesn't just happen on its own. We need to keep fighting for these things. The devil wants to pick people off, but we've got to keep hard to encourage one another to keep following Jesus. And thirdly, remember that people uses people just like us for his kingdom. People who may have picked up some scars along the way, who maybe feel a bit bruised and weary. Some of the people looked at the wall, at the burned and broken rubble, and they said, there's so much rubble, we cannot build the wall. But of course, the rubble is what God wanted them to use to build the wall. Don't dismiss yourselves as mere rubble, thinking of past defeats and being burnt. God can use us not in spite of past wounds, but often because of them. A single piece of rubble can't do much on its own, can it? But as you come to Jesus, you can be a living stone in God's house. 1 Peter 2 says, as you come to him, Jesus, the living stone, rejected by humans but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. So if you're not a Christian here today, please see the invitation in these verses. Jesus Christ is the living stone, inviting you to be part of his spiritual house. Will you be one of the humans in the verses here rejecting Jesus, or will you let him make you acceptable to God by following him? I deleted the next bit because I thought this cultural reference might be, a lot of you might be just too young for this, but this song's been kind of on my mind a little bit as we've been looking at Nehemiah, that old Pink Floyd's song called Another Brick in the Wall. You may know it. It goes, we don't need no education, we don't need no thought control. All in all, you're just another brick in the wall. But Pink Floyd, I mean, this was from my cynical teenage years when I wasn't a Christian. Pink Floyd's idea of the wall was one that separated and divided, like the Berlin Wall. But the Bible's vision of being a stone is that you, each of us, can form part of God's spiritual house. This is a really exciting building project. This is God's dwelling place on earth. Let's be part of it. Okay, so we've looked at derision, danger, and discouragement. Our final D today is dispersal. Let's start with an encouragement. After Nehemiah took appropriate action and reminded the people of their great and awesome God, this frustrated their enemies. Verse 15, when our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to our work. And from that day on, half the men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. So Nehemiah had gathered the people to remind them about God. And that had been effective at refreshing their memories and invigorating their faith. It's like that, isn't that? When we gather together as a church, we can remind one another of truths about God. Our faith is reinforced and we're encouraged by the presence and the faith of our fellow believers. But we can't stay together all the time. We have work to do in order to put food on the table and pay the bills. We have responsibilities outside the church. And so it was with Nehemiah and the people. It was essential to gather together and stir one another with truths about God. But it was also essential to disperse and spread themselves along the 2.5 miles of the wall and get on with their work. So verse 19, then I said to the nobles, the officials and the rest of the people, the work is extensive and spread out, and we're widely separated from each other along the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there. Our God will fight for us. So we continued the work with half the men holding spears. From the first light of dawn till the stars came out. At that time I also said to the people, let every man and his helper stay inside Jerusalem at night, so they can serve us as guards by night and as workers by day. Neither I, nor my brothers, nor my men, nor the guards with me took off our clothes. Each had his weapon, even when he went for water. And so this rhythm of gathering and scattering is normal for God's people. We gather together in a Sunday or in our life groups and prayer meetings to encourage one another. And then we scatter ourselves around for the rest of the week as we fulfill our other responsibilities and as we shine as God's light in this world and engage with lost people to follow Jesus' great commission to go and make disciples. It's important, isn't it, that we don't always stay in a Christian bubble, gathering and scattering, scattering and gathering. That's the rhythm of the Christian life. We need to put great value on these gatherings. It's good to meet as a church, particularly on a Sunday, midweek if we have the opportunities too. When each of us comes to church, it's an encouragement to all the other people. It's not just for our benefit individually. And even if we don't get to speak to other people, just being here is valued by the rest of the church. And when we gather, we rally around what we share in common. We learn from the Bible. We pray to the same God. We sing God's praises. We do this for our own benefit, but also for the benefit of the wider body. What happens if you take a brick out of a wall? Genuine question. Maybe not the first brick, but if you keep taking bricks out of a wall, it's going to weaken it, isn't it? And eventually, it's going to collapse. But did you notice the trumpet in verse 20? When they were spread out along the wall, it wasn't every person for themselves. When they're dispersed, they weren't just on their own. As well as being armed and ready for battle, they were already also to be constantly attentive to the sound of the trumpet. At the sound of the trumpet, all the people would gather ready to fight. And did you notice that the builders were to remain vigilant day and night? Even when they slept, they were to stay clothed. It reminds me of when I served on a Christian camp for many summers in my 20s and 30s. We stayed in tents in a field in Dorset for a couple of weeks at a time. And when storms were forecast, I would sleep in my clothes, partly to keep warm, because I knew that I might have to get up at some point in the night and go around checking on the tents, banging in pegs, fixing canvas that was broken. I was ready for action. And as Christian builders, we need to be ready for action too. So what have we learned about being dispersed? Firstly, let's keep on gathering regularly as a church, reminding one another of what unites us. Let's come together, not just out of habit, but also to encourage one another and to be equipped for the week ahead. And let's make the most of opportunities to gather midweek. Try joining a life group so you can gather with a smaller group midweek. Come and join us for our prayer and fasting week that Rahana was talking about. It's only a week away. And secondly, when we're dispersed, let's do what we can to stay connected with one another so we can support each other even when we come under fire. Did you notice in verse 22 that every man and his helper are to stay together? Pair up. So even when we're dispersed, try to find one or two other Christians to whom you can offer some sort of mutual support and encouragement. Let me just plug the one-to-one discipleship that Rahana organises. If you'd like to be put in touch with another member of this church to disciple or be discipled, please have a chat with Rahana, who has been hosting our service, and she pairs people up to do this. So, in conclusion, do you remember our initial question? How can we keep going as a Christian under fire? We've looked at these 4 challenges that a Christian can face: derision, danger, discouragement, dispersal. In response to these challenges, let's pray and act. Let's not be discouraged. Let's remind ourselves that we're doing this together and not alone. Let's practice this rhythm of gathering and scattering. But when we're scattered, let's stay connected with one another as much as we can.